Now this is recording. RTI
International
Center for
Forensic
Science
presents
Just Science.
Welcome to Just Science, a podcast for justice professionals and anyone interested in learning more about forensic science, innovative technology, current research, and actionable strategies to improve the criminal justice system. In episode 4 of our Applications of Forensic Science for Human Identification season, Just Science sat down with Katharine Pope, a Research Public Health Analyst at RTI International, Dr. Bruce Anderson, a Forensic Anthropologist with the Pima County Office of the Medical Examiner, and Joe Mullins, an instructor at the New York Academy of Art, to discuss human identification using forensic anthropology and facial approximations. From skeletal remains found in the woods to mass casualty events, forensic anthropologists use their knowledge and expertise of biological profile estimation and skeletal trauma analysis to help establish identities for unknown individuals. Forensic artists who are trained in facial approximations use skulls and other identifying information to recreate victims' faces. Listen along as Katharine, Dr. Anderson, and Joe discuss how their disciplines interact, coordination with various entities to resolve cases, and how to get in touch with local forensic anthropologists and forensic artists. This episode is funded by the National Institute of Justice's Forensic Technology Center of Excellence. Here's your host, Jacqueline McKay.
Hello and welcome to Just Science. I'm your host, Jacqueline McKay with the Forensic Technology Center of Excellence, a program of the National Institute of Justice. Today we will be discussing forensic anthropology and facial reconstruction. Here to guide us in our discussion is Katharine Pope, Dr. Bruce Anderson, and Joe Mullins. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Kat, would you mind providing our listeners with an overview of what forensic anthropology is?
Anthropology overall is the study of man, which can include anything from our hominid ancestors to our language to the artifacts we leave behind. So in particular, forensic anthropologists specialize in physical anthropology by focusing on human osteology or the human skeletal system. And that can be from microscopic cells to the largest bony elements in our body. And practitioners are trained to recognize normal human variation, disease, pathology, trauma, and also taphonomic changes, which are how our bodies change after we die. So you asked what a forensic anthropologist is. Forensic anthropologists use their experience in all of that and their knowledge and the context of the scene to help resolve unidentified human remains cases by estimating identifiable features such as age, sex, population affinity, height, and other things that might help identify people.
So would forensic anthropologists only get involved in cases where the remains found are bones?
Not necessarily. I mean, on TV, we usually see forensic anthropologists going out to the woods and helping with skeletal remains. But more often than not, what we're doing is helping out in the lab and during autopsy. So forensic pathologists, the folks that are doing the autopsies, are trained in working with muscle, tissue, organs, and they're there to establish cause and manner of death. And they do that by looking at disease processes and trauma, taking photographs and taking measurements, things like that. So an anthropologist can really get involved when there are disease processes found on bone or trauma to bone and help them identify those features and describe them.
Thank you for that clarification. So would forensic anthropologists be involved in large disaster events and mass fatality events?
Yeah, for sure. We definitely participate in large-scale fatalities, some things that you may not necessarily consider a crisis, like our missing and unidentified persons cases around the country. I consider a mass fatality. It's kind of a silent mass disaster crisis. But we can assist in establishing minimum number of individuals that are deceased because we have the ability to tell exactly who is where and when. And I think Bruce can definitely talk a little bit more about this mass casualty event we're experiencing in the United States with our unidentified persons caseload.
Kat, you worked for the Disaster Mortuary Operational Response Teams, also known as DMORT. Can you talk a little bit more about how they operate and how forensic anthropologists are involved in their response?
The Disaster Mortuary Operational Response Team, DMORT, is a group of individuals, funeral directors, forensic anthropologists, medical legal death investigators, radiologists, forensic odontologists, anybody that's comfortable and familiar with working on unidentified human remains to help establish positive scientific identification. They would be called out in these mass fatality events. So this could be a train accident or an aircraft accident that has caused more than, like 5 individuals dying in one event. And this could also be hurricanes. And it's generally cases that are here in the United States. And it's whenever a medical examiner kind of gets overwhelmed that a lot of medical examiner and coroner offices are set up to handle their normal workflow, the normal natural deaths without primary care doctors or drug overdoses, suicides, homicides. That normal standard is what they handle daily. And if there's an influx, they will call DMORT for assistance in those events. But what we're worried about is establishing positive scientific identification.
I really like that you hit on in disaster fatality that it's about cooperation and all these entities are trying to work together in order to help establish identities. So switching gears a little bit, Bruce, you're a forensic anthropologist that works for a medical examiner's office. Can you explain how you would get involved with a case when remains are found?
Typically, those of us that work in a medical examiner or coroner's office, we get a request from the forensic pathologist after the autopsy is completed. And that could be a traditional autopsy on fleshed remains, or that could be a single sun-bleached bone that was found out in the desert. But almost always it's the forensic pathologist who needs another question or a couple of questions addressed that can't be easily addressed from a standard autopsy. And that can be everything from a single bone identification to a personal identification of an individual, to a trauma analysis, to how long the person's been dead. So there's a variety of determinations a forensic anthropologist can make that is based on training that most forensic pathologists never receive.
Would there ever be a case where you might respond to a crime scene in order to help properly collect the bones that are found, or are you mostly coming in after the autopsy has already been performed?
We assist law enforcement at, I don't know if it's the crime scene per se, but at the burial site. We've been training in our jurisdiction here in Southern Arizona. We've been training law enforcement and continue to train law enforcement on proper archaeological techniques to remove fleshed remains from clandestine graves. And then when those fleshed remains become partially skeletal or totally skeletal, we try to impress upon them during this training that they might want to get a forensic anthropologist involved. So depending on the agency here in Southern Arizona, some will call us for a body. Some will only call us when the bones are loose in a grave. But we assist regularly, several times a year, on clandestine graves or surface scatter, or a body's been dumped ostensibly out in the wilderness, and then it's taken weeks or months to find now the partial skeletal remains.
Thank you for that distinction between crime scenes and the actual place where the remains are found, because as we know, they're not necessarily always the same. And I know that training that you are providing law enforcement is greatly appreciated. I know Kat already mentioned that anthropologists can help determine age and sex, but are there any other insights that a forensic anthropologist can glean from the bones in order to help add to a death investigation or help to identify an individual?
Well, increasingly, especially with cell phone technology, with cameras built into cell phone, we're asked to determine whether a single bone found out in the desert, out in the wilderness. And a lot of times the finder, the discoverer can tell. Sometimes they can't. They know that they can always call us, text us, send us an email with a photograph, and we can make a determination typically from a photograph or two. So right off the bat, forensic anthropologists, much more than a forensic pathologist, are able to make that determination from a single bone, especially a bone that's been weathered and maybe been gnawed on by animals. And then we go down, if it's a whole skeleton or a whole body, we go down the list of sex, biological sex, age within 5, 10, 15 years is usually doable from the skeleton. A lot of times ancestry is important. Stature within 3 or 4 inches. If we can measure a long bone, we can typically get at the mean stature. Here in Arizona, we don't have a forensic odontologist on staff, so we actually examine the dentition as well. So if we have a missing persons report with a description of the teeth, then we'll do a full dental description on the postmortem side, and then compare those descriptions with any missing persons report that contains a dental description. So everything from is it human to is it non-human to has the child been abused in the past? Is a fresh break in the skeletal system, is that consistent with events that might have took the person's life? Or is it maybe more consistent with events that have to do with animal scavenging?
For some of our listeners that are interested in possibly pursuing a career in forensic anthropology, what kind of background would you suggest that they have?
Well, you need to become expert in the human skeleton. And typically that means study anthropology and study physical anthropology or biological anthropology with an emphasis on the human skeleton. Not just at the bachelor's degree level. You need to go to graduate school and get a graduate degree, and you need to keep practicing on whole skeletons and partial skeletons that have been left out in the elements for a long time. And you need to know more about the human skeleton than the pathologists that are going to ask you to assist. And if you can demonstrate that, then you can probably find a job. After that, you need to know how to apply skeletal analysis to the medical legal world. There's really at least 2 different ways to write a skeletal report. One traditional one that we used to write for archaeologists, with an archaeologist in mind, or maybe an academic journal. Maybe we're trying to publish something, so we write reports and descriptions that are flowery and maybe full of jargon. But in the world of medical legal death investigation, that's not what the pathologists want. That's not what the police want. That's not what the courts want. They want a clear, concise description of what you did and what your findings are. To get back to the initial question, how do you become a forensic anthropologist? In my opinion, first you learn as much as you can about the human skeleton, and then you learn how to apply that knowledge to report writing and verbal communication with pathologists, the courts, and sometimes with the families of the victims.
I think that was so interesting, Bruce, because in my experience, gaining the trust of the forensic pathologist, the medical examiner or coroner that you're working for is critical. There are not a lot of jobs for forensic anthropologists, full-time forensic anthropologists in the world. And so many of us pursued that career using the dual role, and we became death investigators first. And then we were able to show our medical examiners what we could do for them. And all of these things that Bruce described were like icing on the cake. I can handle the typical run-of-the-mill stuff that happens in a medical examiner, but I can also do a trauma report for you. And the doctors really appreciated that. Being able to apply yourself above and beyond the normal scope of duty is a way to use that experience and education in a medical legal setting.
Bruce, one more question for you. If investigators do not have a forensic anthropologist assigned to their medical legal death investigation office in their jurisdiction, how would you recommend they get in touch with one?
Well, there's likely a college or university nearby, maybe a junior college that has an anthropologist, so they probably know of somebody. But increasingly, the better way to go is to try to retain a board-certified forensic anthropologist. So my advice would be to go to our website, the website of the American Board of Forensic Anthropology. That website is theabfa.org. And you'll find somebody in your neck of the woods that can help you. Additionally, NAMUS, the NAMUS program used to offer anthropology services. With the new organization of NAMUS, I think probably there'll also be an anthropology service. If it hasn't been announced yet, it will be shortly. But you're going to find a qualified and probably experienced forensic anthropologist to help you.
Perfect. Thank you for that. We'll make sure links to those resources will be on our website. Okay, switching gears a bit to forensic art and facial reconstruction. Kat brought up the mass disaster of unidentified remains throughout the United States. So, Joe, can you walk us through your work as a forensic artist and how you can use skulls to recreate the faces of decedents and hopefully help get these individuals identified?
I'm always excited to explain the process of what exactly a role the forensic artist plays in assisting law enforcement and the medical examiner's offices, investigators, everybody across the board. I think just a misconception on the process as a whole and as a profession. So what Bruce and Kat's, everything that they do is, I feel like they've done all the hard work for me. I just come in and based on the information provided by them, my only concern is I want a fully intact skull. So the cranium and the mandible is the parts that I need to put the facial approximation process and get that victim identified. As a forensic artist, I'm not exactly on the front lines. The cases usually come to us when everything else has been exhausted. All the investigative tools have not hit any significant find. So it's one of those things it's necessary tool that's proven useful. So when the skull comes to us, Kat and Bruce have done their assessment to give me the information. So I need an outline drawn basically for what this victim looked like in life. So looking at the skull, they're able to tell remarkable details of what this person looked like in life, come to the age range, the ancestry, male or female, the condition of the bones, and everything about this skull is the foundation that our faces are built on. So we're able to go through the process and put a face back on these skeletal remains in hopes to get them identified. Now, this conception, as we're doing these images, we're never going to come up with a exact likeness or portrait of what these victims looked like in life. It's kind of based on majority rules as far as what the anthropologists are supplying, the information they're giving us, and we're applying that to these skulls. Now, each skull is just as unique as a face, and it would be impossible to come up with a portrait of exact likeness, I guess, of what these people look like in life. But we found that we don't have to come up with an exact likeness with these images, as the case information goes out on our missingkids.com site, name us, any and all social media, any outlets possible, because the only way these images that we create work is that the right person sees it. So we want as many eyes possible on this. And when they see it, it's not necessarily like, hey, I know, it's like spark recognition, I know exactly who that is. It's typically a response like, hey, that sort of looks like my cousin. I haven't seen him in 6 years. I think that could be him. Basically, I've done my job successfully if it generates a phone call and says, hey, I think I know who that is.
So, Joe, you mentioned that you obviously need a fully intact skull and mandible, and you also receive information from the anthropologist. Can you maybe describe a little bit about what that information actually entails and what specific information you need in order to create the reconstruction of the face?
The bare essentials, I guess, that I need really depends on the case. Sometimes there's fragmented skulls that could be scattered remains, or there's a case that we only find a cranium and with no mandible because they're scavenged and they can't find all the other bones. But the information that provided to us is, the age range, male or female, and ancestry. So it could be, Black, white, or Asian, or admixture of any of the three, the ancestry components. And those ingredients are really the three main that I can move forward with. The more information that I'm provided, the better. There's clothing found with the skeletal remains, or hair is found with the skeletal remains, or all those added details, because if it's a dry skeleton, unless there's extreme situations, we have no idea about stature, for example. We have no idea if somebody was 150 pounds or 300 pounds. And as a forensic artist, I have a very limited artistic license. The faces that a forensic artist create can only come from the foundation in the skull the information you're given. You have to work within those parameters, painted very strictly by the forensic anthropologist that has given you those guidelines to work within. You start going one way or the other off the rails, that's using artistic license, and that's not going to help get that victim identified.
Joe, as you've said, basic anatomy practically dictates how the muscles lay over the bones in the face. But for features like the nose and the ears that are built from cartilage, is there a lot of wiggle room in their approximation? And what techniques do you use to try to help rebuild those features?
Now, there are variations with the soft tissue, and as I mentioned, it's kind of a majority rules where forensic anthropology is applied to putting these faces back on, especially in the realm of, you mentioned, noses and ears. So for the nose, for example, you get information on the projection of the nose, the width of the nose. You can see kind of where the top of the nostrils start. So you do get some information. As far as ears, very limited information on ears. You get basic, height, angle, just some information where they have, attached or detached earlobes. But ears, for example, since you mentioned that, are not crucial for doing a facial approximation. And when the classes and courses I teach as we're doing this, you have to assume that this victim has ears, so you have to represent them with the limited information we have from the skull. And the ears just shouldn't be a focal point. So when you see a facial approximation that we've created from the skeletal remains, the first thing that somebody says is, "Oh, look at the ears on that. That means I've done something wrong." That should not be the case. It should focus on the face and what we know.
So in regards to sparking the recognition and getting the reconstruction out to the right person, what are some ways that the renderings are distributed in order to try to make sure as many people as possible can see these renderings?
We live in a wonderful time with, social media seems to be a huge venue for us, for investigative purposes, to get these images out to as many eyes as possible. Now, you want a case from Kat and Bruce over the years. I just want a Bruce's case. You want to focus the area where the remains were found. But sometimes just because the remains were found in Arizona, that doesn't mean that victim is from Arizona. So with that in mind, you want the world population to see it. So last I checked, I think there was like 7.8 billion people on the planet. It'd be great if everybody saw it, because I can't stress enough that these images, they don't work unless the right person sees it. It's a collaborative effort. It's a wonderful world where art and science work together. You don't get that in many other disciplines.
We've come a long way, haven't we, Joe, from the 70s, when sometimes the artist would work with an anthropologist, sometimes not. The technique was called facial reproduction, which was a misnomer because what is called today, and this is only maybe 10 years old, I think you all decided facial approximation would be a better description of what you guys are doing. But I can think of where a facial approximation was extremely beneficial. A former colleague of mine here in Tucson, Dr. Angela Soler, who works in the Manhattan office of the chief medical examiner, was featured in an AP story about a woman who went missing in New York City, I think about 30 years ago. And the family saw a facial approximation, and the family called Angela and her cold case forensic science team in Manhattan and started exchange information. And turned out that this particular instance wasn't going to be the missing woman, but the family member gave enough information to the anthropologist, Dr. Soler, to where she remembered we have another unidentified woman from this same time period. And lo and behold, by the time they got the DNA done, they now have an identification. And it was a facial approximation that was realistic looking enough to have a family member or a friend contact the authorities and give more information. So I'm a big believer in it because, especially when you only have a skeleton, there's not a whole lot we can show the family or the public when we have a skeleton. But if Joe and people like Joe can put a face on it, then we're going to get more people interested. And there's an image we can show. And it could be like this recent case in New York City. It could lead to an identification, even though the facial approximation didn't really fit what the missing person looked like. So kudos, Joe.
Just this morning when I got here, a supervisor shared with me, there was a case that I'd done that was a direct result from the investigative tool, looking at seeing the facial approximation we had done from a skull before, and then reinvestigating a cold case and remembering, I guess the investigator was taken with the image he'd seen, and he remembered it, seeing it, went back and turned out to be a match. So it was a 39-year-old case that family now has the answer. It was the daughter that was looking for a mother now has those answers, what happened as a direct result of the facial approximation and all the work that the anthropologist, the investigator, the collaborative effort that goes into this. It just justifies for me that I think I got the coolest job in the world, that I helped Lynn to answer those questions. That family has been frozen in uncertainty for 39 years.
Thank you both so much for those case examples. I think it's so important to not only describe how the science works and what all goes into the process, but also show positive case results of this actually working and helping people and giving people their names back. So, Joe, in your facial approximations, how do you know when you're finished?
I've been doing this for 23 years, and that is a question that has popped up repeatedly. And I came up with a sound bites type of response that when I'm working, especially working with clay, you got your hands very, hands-on, type of process. You can't help but get, I guess, emotionally attached to the case that you're working on, and you're filling in the blanks or trying to come up with answers to what happened to this person, who they were, what they were doing, those types of things. But it comes a point when you just like day one, when you start, it's a skull. Then as you slowly start to build it up, it's not a skull anymore. It's a person. So I stop when I see somebody staring back at me. The classes I teach, that's where collaboration with both Kat and Bruce, with the class I teach up in New York, where I give the art students, an opportunity to work on actual cases. By day 3, usually Wednesday, as the students are involved with the face is coming, 100% everybody says, I understand exactly what you were talking about. So that is exactly what's happening. That it's not a skull anymore, it's a person. They get emotionally attached to the work, and I can't help but have that emotional response to this type of work. And I guess that's what drives us to. That's why we love what we do. I guess we feel like we're making a difference in answering those questions.
Joe, when your students are doing the sculptures to make the facial approximation, are they actually working with the real skull?
No, that was one of the big hurdles to get over when I first came up with the idea with Dr. Brad Adams up at the New York City Medical Examiner's Office. That may have been the first thing out of Brad's mouth was absolutely not. I'm not giving you 15 skulls to turn loose with a bunch of artists. So fast forward with technology, now we can do scans of the skulls. So all the students are working with 3D prints of the actual skulls. So the actual skulls stay with the medical examiner or investigator or wherever they're at.
Let me just say, too, our office, the Pima County Office of the Medical Examiner, greatly values our long-term relationship with NCMEC. Founded, I believe, in about 1980, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. And just about a year and a half ago, they offered to do a facial approximation on a young homicide victim, a teenage girl who we didn't know who she was. We now know through this new tool of investigative genetic genealogy who she is. But NCMEC produced a very nice image, and I took the skull of this teenage girl over to their imaging department. And then they put the CT data on a disc. We got the disc back. The skull never left my eyesight. We brought her back here to our office, sent NCMEC the CT data, and then they reconstructed a skull and put that very believable face on that skull. So technology has certainly helped us.
Joe, if someone wanted to get involved with forensic art and possibly become a forensic artist, how would you recommend they become involved in the field?
It is a tough job to get because there's not a lot of us out there that do the facial approximations as a full-time job. We have 4 full-time artists here at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, Forensic Services Unit, where we are really the envy of the forensic art world, because that's what we do all day, every day is forensic arts, whether it be age progression of a long-term missing child, fugitive updates, age progression of adults, morgue photos, and all the facial approximations from skeletal are made. So it's what we do all day, every day. Most larger law enforcement agencies have composite artists, but not necessarily not a forensic artist. So if you want to do this, from my perspective, after 23 years, and it behooves you to be a fine artist first. You can specialize in composite sketches. You can specialize in facial approximation. You can specialize in a few different disciplines in the forensic arts field. But so get a degree in fine arts. So like painting, drawing, sculpting. That's where my background came from, a degree in fine art and graphic design. So that included learning Adobe Photoshop, for example.
Thank you, everyone, for your insight. Before we close, is there anything else you'd like to tell our listeners or any closing remarks you'd like to leave them with?
I guess if there are people listening out there that have a loved one missing, that they haven't seen them, please go to your local police department and report them missing.
Kat, Bruce, and Joe, it has truly been a pleasure speaking with you today. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing your knowledge with all of us.
Cheers. Thanks a lot.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Mine too. I appreciate the opportunity.
If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to like and follow Just Science on your platform of choice. For more information on today's topic and resources in the forensics field, visit forensiccoe.org. I'm Jacqueline McKay, and this has been another episode of Just Science.
This episode concludes our 2022 Applications of Forensic Science for Human Identification season. Tune in for the next season of Just Science, which will cover various topics on human trafficking. Opinions or points of views expressed in this podcast represent a consensus of the authors and do not necessarily represent the official position or policies of its funding.